My name is Blair. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words like steady, reasonable, and low maintenance. I work, I pay my bills on time, I don't raise my voice, and I don't like unnecessary conflict. If you ask the people around me to summarize who I am, many of them would probably say, "She's fine, she's always fine." That assumption that I'm fine, that I don't need much, that I'll adapt, has followed me into every room I've ever entered. It made it easy for me to overlook, easy to rely on, easy to misunderstand. I'm telling the story not because it's dramatic, but because it's honest. And because silence, when misunderstood long enough, starts turning into a lie. For a long time, I let other people tell my story for me, quietly, casually, sometimes with sympathy, sometimes with humor. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct the record. I told myself it wasn't worth the energy, that truth didn't need defending. This story is about what happens when that belief collides with reality. On the surface, it's about a marriage that ended and the story that got passed around afterward. A simple one. Familiar. Easy to digest. She left him. She walked away. She abandoned him. That's the version most people heard. What they didn't hear, what I didn't rush to explain, was that I was still paying the rent on the place he lived in. That my name was still quietly attached to responsibilities no one associated with me anymore. That while one narrative traveled freely, another stayed locked in bank statements, email threads, and digital receipts. I'm not sharing this to expose anyone or to score points. There's no shouting match in this story, no grand revenge, no moment where I suddenly become someone else. What happened unfolded slowly, almost politely, the way real life usually does. This is a story about perception versus documentation, about how people fill in gaps when silence makes them uncomfortable, about how being calm is often mistaken for being weak, and how clarity doesn't always announce itself loudly. Over the next chapters, I'll walk you through who I was to the people around me, the small moments that taught me what role I had been assigned, and the quiet shift that happened long before anyone else noticed. You'll hear how I learned to stop correcting assumptions and started simply observing them, how I prepared, not out of anger, but out of self-respect, and how the receipts, unemotional, precise, indifferent, ended up telling a very different story than the one being repeated at dinner tables. There's no villain monologue here, just choices, timelines, and consequences that arrived without spectacle. I believe there's value in telling stories like this, especially for people who have been underestimated, mischaracterized, or spoken for. Not because we need validation, but because clarity has its own quiet power. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, gently, honestly. Have you ever stayed silent long enough that someone else started telling your story for you? To the people around me, I was never a mystery. I was simple, predictable. The kind of woman you don't worry about because she always seems to have things handled. I was the one who remembered birthdays without reminders, the one who filed paperwork early, the one who showed up when someone needed help moving, or watching a dog, or proofreading something at the last minute. I didn't announce these things, I just did them. And because I didn't complain, they became part of the background, useful, dependable, quietly replaceable. In social settings, I was often introduced last, if at all. Not out of malice, more out of habit. "This is Blair," someone would say, already turning away, as if the name itself completed the explanation. No follow-up, no context. I learned early that people didn't expect a story from me. In my marriage, that perception settled even deeper. My husband liked to tell people I was low drama. He meant it as a compliment. Others echoed it. "She's easy. She doesn't make a fuss. She's understanding." What they really meant was, "She won't push back." When decisions were made, I was consulted late, after opinions had already solidified. When plans changed, I was informed, not asked. If something went wrong, I was expected to adapt quietly. And I did. Not because I didn't notice, but because I was taught, subtly, repeatedly, that my discomfort didn't require a response. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't feel cruel while it's happening. It feels practical, efficient. You tell yourself you're being mature, that this is what adulthood looks like, absorbing friction so others don't have to feel it. Friends would confide in me, but rarely ask how I was doing in return. Family members praised my patience, never questioning what it cost. At gatherings, I often found myself holding coats, refilling drinks, and clearing plates, tasks that made me useful but kept me on the edges of conversations. No one asked if I was tired, and the truth is, I didn't offer that information. I had learned that my role wasn't to be seen, it was to keep things running smoothly, to be the emotional infrastructure everyone relied on, but no one examined. Even then, I wasn't bitter. I didn't feel victimized. I felt designated. There's a difference. I was designated as the responsible one, the one who could handle more, the one who didn't need checking in on. That designation followed me everywhere. At work, I was trusted with sensitive tasks, but passed over for visible recognition. At home, I was praised for being understanding whenever something fell on my shoulders by default. People liked the version of me that didn't take up space. And because I didn't contradict that version, it solidified into truth for them. Looking back, I can see how neatly the role fit into the story that would later be told about me. When someone is quiet for long enough, people assume silence is absence. That compliance is consent. That stability means satisfaction. I wasn't invisible because I was insignificant. I was invisible because I made things easier. And when you make things easy for long enough, people forget that effort is involved at all. That's who I was to them. Reliable, calm, peripheral. The kind of person you don't imagine leaving because you don't fully imagine them choosing. The first time it happened, it was so small I almost missed it. We were at a dinner with friends. Nothing formal, just a casual weeknight gathering. Someone asked a question about our plans for the next year, and before I could answer, my husband spoke for me. Not aggressively, not loudly, just confidently. He outlined a version of our future that I hadn't agreed to, hadn't even discussed in detail. I remember smiling, nodding, letting the moment pass. That's how these things begin, not with cruelty, but with convenience. It was easier for him to answer, easier for everyone else to listen. And because I didn't interrupt, the story landed cleanly. Later that night, I mentioned it gently. I said, "I didn't realize we'd decided that already." He laughed, not unkindly. "You're flexible," he said. "You always are." It wasn't meant to hurt. That's what made it confusing. There was no malice to react to, no clear offense to point at. Just a quiet adjustment is being made on my behalf. I told myself it didn't matter. Those relationships require give and take. That this was given. The next small cut came a few weeks later. A financial decision. Again, nothing dramatic. I noticed a transfer from our joint account that I hadn't been told about. When I asked, he explained it as if I'd simply forgotten. "I mentioned it," he said. "You must not remember." I did remember, very clearly. That conversation hadn't happened, but I let it go. Because pushing back would have required energy, and because I didn't want to be the person who nitpicked details when things were basically fine. That phrase, basically fine, became my internal justification for everything. Friends didn't notice these moments. Why would they? From the outside, nothing was wrong. If anything, we looked solid. He was expressive, social, and openly frustrated about the pressures he was under. I was calm, composed, and quietly supportive. A good balance, people said. What they didn't see was how often my preferences were treated as optional, how my silence was interpreted as agreement, how easily decisions slid past me once it was assumed I wouldn't object. The cuts were small enough to dismiss individually. That's the trick of them. Each one feels unworthy of attention, but they accumulate, slowly, precisely. I started noticing how often phrases like "Blair doesn't mind" were used without anyone checking if that was true. how plans involving my time, my money, and my emotional labor were discussed as if they were already approved. Once someone joked, "She's the easy one. You're lucky." Everyone laughed, including me. That laughter stuck with me longer than it should have. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt in a way that demanded tears. I was alert. Something had shifted, not dramatically, but directionally, and I could feel myself being moved inch by inch into a smaller outline of who I was allowed to be. I still didn't confront it head on. I didn't label it. I just started noticing, listening more closely, remembering details I used to dismiss. Because the first small cut doesn't bleed. It just teaches you where the blade is. Once I noticed the pattern, it became impossible to unsee. Not because it escalated suddenly, but because it repeated. Quietly. Reliably. With just enough plausibility that no single moment could stand alone as proof of anything being wrong. That's how disrespect survives. It doesn't announce itself. It blends in. I began to recognize how often my absence from decisions was framed as trust. He knows you so well. How my silence was praised as maturity. You're not like other people. You don't get emotional about this stuff. How my flexibility slowly turned into expectation. If I questioned something, even gently, the response was always reasonable. Never defensive, never cruel, just explanatory. You're overthinking. It's not a big deal. I thought you'd be okay with it. And because I was usually okay, because I could adapt, recalibrate, absorb, I became the safest place to offload inconvenience. At some point, I stopped bringing things up at all. Not consciously, more like a reflex. I could predict how the conversation would go before it happened. The mild confusion, the reassurance. The subtle implication was that I was introducing unnecessary tension into an otherwise functional system. So I did what I'd always done. I stayed quiet. I told myself I was choosing peace, that I was being strategic, that not every thought needed to be spoken. And maybe part of that was true, but another part was simpler and harder to admit. I didn't feel like my discomfort carried enough weight to change the outcome. When friends vented about my husband, I defended him reflexively. When they joked about how much he relied on me, I smiled. When someone said, "I don't know how he'd manage without you," it sounded like praise, but it landed like a warning. At home, the imbalance became routine. Bills were discussed after they were paid. Plans were made before I was asked. My contributions were assumed, his struggles were emphasized. If I ever tried to articulate how this made me feel, the words sounded thin even to me. There was no obvious harm, no raised voices, no betrayal that could be pointed to, just a slow erosion of authorship over my own life. So I rationalized, this is marriage, this is a partnership, this is what stability looks like. I convinced myself that wanting to be consulted was a luxury, not a right. That wanting recognition was vanity, that asking for more space, more consideration was unnecessary when things were working. What I didn't realize then was that working had come to mean working for everyone else. The most dangerous part of normalization isn't that others stop noticing. It's what you do. You stop checking in with yourself. You stop measuring what you give against what you receive. You stop expecting reciprocity. And once disrespect becomes normal, it stops feeling like a violation. It just feels like the weather, something you dress around and endure. By the time I understood that, the role had already solidified. Not because anyone forced it on me, but because I stayed quiet long enough for it to feel permanent. I didn't wake up one day and realize I had been assigned a role. It revealed itself slowly in the way people speak to you when they think they already know who you are. I was the reliable one, the reasonable one, the one who would understand. That word, understand, did a lot of work in my life. It excused oversights. It softened apologies that never came. It allowed expectations to grow without ever being negotiated. If something needed to be handled, it landed with me. If something went wrong, it was quietly assumed I would smooth it over. I wasn't asked if I could carry more. I was trusted to. And trust, when it's one-sided, starts to feel like an obligation. In my marriage, the division was unspoken but precise. His stress was visible, discussed, and sympathized with. Mine was invisible because I didn't display it in ways that disrupted anyone else's comfort. When he struggled financially, it was framed as temporary. When I compensated for it, it was framed as support. Over time, support turned into structure, and structure turned into expectation. I handled logistics, I remembered deadlines, I adjusted, I absorbed, and because I did it well, no one questioned whether I should. People around us reinforced it without realizing. "You're so lucky to have her," they'd tell him, and then they'd look at me and say, "You're just good at this stuff." This stuff. As if my competence wasn't learned, as if my patience didn't have a cost. The role extended beyond my marriage. At work, I was the person who fixed problems without escalating them, who took on tasks no one else wanted because I knew they'd get done. Promotions came slowly, if at all. Responsibility arrived quickly. I became fluent in being underestimated. People assumed my calm meant I lacked ambition, that my compliance meant I lacked boundaries, that my silence meant I lacked opinions. What they didn't see was how much I was noticing, how carefully I was tracking patterns, how often I was making choices not to speak, not because I couldn't, but because I was learning. The role I was assigned was invisible, but it was rigid. Deviating from it caused discomfort, not for me, but for others. Any sign of resistance felt unexpected, almost inappropriate. So I stayed within the lines. I fulfilled the role perfectly. And in doing so, I learned exactly how it functioned. I learned what people took for granted. I learned what they never checked. I learned how much weight silence could carry. Because when you are assigned the role of the dependable one, you are given access to systems, to finances, to inform others. Don't bother to understand because they trust you'll handle it. That access became my education. I didn't plan anything. I didn't scheme. I simply paid attention. And the more I understood the structure I was holding up, the clearer it became that it rested almost entirely on me. The role I was assigned was meant to make me smaller. Instead, it showed me where the leverage was. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no accusation, no raised voice or slammed door. It was an ordinary afternoon, quiet enough that I might have forgotten it entirely if it hadn't rearranged something inside me. I was sitting at the small desk by the window paying bills, the same routine I'd done dozens of times before. I had my planner open, receipts tucked neatly inside, numbers lining up the way they always did. It was calm, familiar, almost comforting. Then I noticed something that didn't align. It wasn't a dramatic discrepancy, just a payment that had been labeled casually in conversation, but didn't match the reality of where the money had gone. I traced it back. 1 month, then another, then another. Patterns don't announce themselves. You have to look at them twice before they admit they're there. What struck me wasn't anger, it was clarity. I realized I knew more about our financial structure than the person who spoke most confidently about it. I realized how often I'd been told a version of events that relied on my not checking, on my being tired, on my assumption of good faith. And in that moment, something subtle but irreversible happened. I stopped asking why. I started asking how. Not how to confront, not how to fix, but how things actually worked beneath the story being told about them. I closed my planner, not in frustration, deliberately. I sat there and let the realization settle, that my role hadn't just been emotional support or flexibility, it had been infrastructure. I had been the quiet constant that made other narratives possible. Later that evening, my husband complained lightly about how misunderstood he felt lately, about how people didn't see how much pressure he was under. I listened. I nodded. I didn't correct anything. For the first time, my silence wasn't automatic. It was chosen. I remember thinking, I don't need to explain myself right now. Not because I was afraid to, but because I didn't owe immediacy to anyone else's comfort. That was the shift. I didn't become colder. I didn't withdraw emotionally. I simply stopped volunteering information that had always been used without question. I stopped smoothing over inconsistencies before they had a chance to reveal themselves. It felt strange at first, almost irresponsible, as if I were neglecting a duty I'd been assigned without consent. But underneath that discomfort was something steadier, a sense of internal alignment I hadn't felt in a long time. I wasn't plotting, I wasn't angry, I was awake. That night, I opened a new section in my planner. No labels, no conclusions, just dates, numbers, facts, not because I planned to use them, but because I finally understood the value of knowing exactly where I stood. The shift wasn't about leaving, it wasn't about confrontation, it was about reclaiming authorship. And once that happens, even quietly, nothing ever goes back to the way it was before. After that day, nothing on the surface changed. That was the most disorienting part. I still showed up, I still listened, I still responded with the same calm tone people were used to. If anyone had asked, they would have said things felt stable, normal, fine. But inside, my silence had shifted from habit to intention. Before, I stayed quiet because it felt easier, because speaking up seemed unnecessary, inefficient, or disruptive. Now, I stayed quiet because I was observing, because every unchallenged assumption revealed something useful, because people, when uncorrected, continue speaking until they reach the truth they believe most. I noticed how often my husband narrated his struggles in ways that centered him as the one holding everything together. How casually he referenced being on his own emotionally, even while leaning on structures I maintained. I didn't interrupt. Friends started asking how he was doing after the separation became more apparent. Their concern was genuine. Their framing was automatic. I was mentioned in passing, usually as the one who had needed space. I let the words hang there. Each time someone spoke on my behalf, I learned how they saw me. What story made sense to them? What assumptions filled the gaps my silence left behind? And I learned something else too. Silence unsettles people when it stops being reactive. At first, my quiet was comfortable to them. It confirmed what they thought they knew. But as time passed, and I didn't perform the expected emotional cues, didn't over-explain, didn't defend, didn't justify, something shifted. People started filling the space themselves. My husband grew more expressive in public, more open about feeling abandoned, about not knowing what he'd done wrong. He said these things with sincerity, and because he said them out loud, they gained weight. I said nothing. Not because I was shrinking, but because I was choosing not to compete with a narrative that required my participation to function. Behind the scenes, I was still handling practicalities. Quietly, automatically, rent was paid, accounts stayed current. Responsibilities I had never publicly claimed continued to be met without commentary. It was strange watching the contrast form. On one side, a visible story of struggle. On the other hand, an invisible reality of support. And the more I stayed silent, the more confident others became in their interpretation. They praised my husband for holding it together. They spoke to me gently, cautiously, as if I were fragile. I didn't correct them. Silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes a mirror. It reflects not who you are, but who others assume you to be when they stop checking. I wasn't waiting for a moment to speak. I wasn't building toward an emotional reveal. I was allowing time to do what it always does, clarify patterns. Because narratives that aren't anchored in facts eventually overextend themselves. They start contradicting reality in small ways. They rely on the assumption that no one will look too closely. I was looking, and for the first time, my quiet wasn't a concession. It was a position. While everything looked unchanged on the surface, something else was happening, methodically, almost invisibly. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like patience. I began documenting things the way I always had, but with a different level of intention. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just thoroughly. Dates, amounts, agreements as they had actually occurred, not as they were later described. I didn't confront discrepancies anymore. I let them exist. I saved emails instead of replying to them immediately. I archived messages without commentary. I took screenshots of transactions that had once felt too small to matter. I organized folders the way someone does when they expect clarity, not conflict. No one noticed because nothing I was doing was new. I had always been the organized one. The difference was that this time I wasn't organizing for the sake of smoothness. I was organizing for accuracy. My husband continued to speak publicly about how suddenly everything had fallen apart, how confused he felt, how unsupported he was. People nodded, they offered empathy. They didn't question the timeline. I didn't either, out loud. Behind the scenes, I traced responsibility the way you trace wiring in a wall. Quietly, carefully, until you understand what powers what. I learned how much was attached to my name, not because I demanded control, but because I had been trusted with it by default. Bills, leases, auto payments that hadn't been revisited in years, things no one thought to check because they had never failed. That trust had never been verbalized. It didn't need to be. It was reinforced every time something worked without incident. What surprised me wasn't the imbalance, it was how invisible it was to everyone else. Friends would say things like, "I hope he's okay financially," not knowing that he was, because I had made sure of it, that his stability was still partially scaffolded by systems I hadn't dismantled yet, and I didn't rush to dismantle them. There's a misconception that preparation is driven by anger, that people only gather facts when they want to use them as weapons. That wasn't true for me. I was preparing so I could leave without chaos, so that when I eventually spoke, I wouldn't have to raise my voice, so that reality, when it surfaced, would stand on its own. I wasn't trying to be believed. I was making sure I couldn't be dismissed. They never noticed because I didn't change my demeanor. I didn't become secretive. I didn't withdraw. I remained consistent. Consistency is disarming. It allows others to project stability onto you while assuming nothing beneath it has changed. But something had changed. I had stopped cushioning misunderstandings. I had stopped correcting false impressions before they fully formed. I let the story be told without me, and in doing so, I learned exactly how much it relied on my silence to survive. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no sharp intake of breath, no cinematic pause where everything suddenly made sense. It arrived the way truth usually does when you're paying attention, quietly, then all at once. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table late one evening, the apartment lit only by a single lamp. The house was silent in that way that feels earned, not lonely. I had spread out documents in neat rows, not because I needed to, but because seeing things clearly has always helped me think. Bank statements, lease agreements, email confirmations, payment histories. Individually, each item was ordinary. Together, they formed something undeniable. I wasn't just supporting my husband in the abstract way people imagine when they talk about emotional labor. I wasn't just helping out during a difficult transition. I was underwriting his stability. Rent payments, automatic, consistent, traced directly back to my account. Utilities, still under my name, still paid on time. Insurance, subscriptions, quiet expenses, no one talked about because they never caused problems. I followed the timeline carefully, month by month, line by line, and that's when I saw it clearly. The story being told publicly could only exist because of the reality being maintained privately. He spoke about being abandoned. I was ensuring he wasn't displaced. He talked about suddenly being on his own. I was still financially present in ways no one acknowledged or questioned. It wasn't fraud. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even intentionally malicious. It was something more mundane and more revealing, a narrative gap sustained by my silence and my reliability. What struck me most wasn't the imbalance itself. It was how confidently people spoke in its absence. Friends said things like, "I can't imagine how hard it must be for him figuring things out alone." They said it with such certainty, such compassion. And they weren't wrong to feel compassion, but they were wrong about the facts. I sat there that night and felt something unexpected, not anger, not vindication, not even sadness. I felt relief, because for the first time I wasn't guessing. I wasn't interpreting tone or intention. I wasn't wondering if I was being unfair or dramatic or too sensitive. The numbers didn't have opinions. The receipts didn't reinterpret themselves. The timeline didn't soften out of kindness. They just existed. I realized then that I had leverage, not in the manipulative sense people imagine, but in the structural one. I had proof, not for court, not even necessarily for confrontation, proof for myself. Proof that I wasn't imagining the imbalance, proof that my silence had been subsidizing a false simplicity, proof that the role I'd been assigned had tangible weight. I remember closing my eyes and sitting with that knowledge for a long time. There was no urge to expose anything, no desire to send screenshots or correct group conversations. In fact, the clarity made me calmer than I'd been in months. Because once you know the truth in full, you stop reacting to partial versions of it. What followed was a period of quiet recalibration. I stopped asking myself, should I say something? I started asking, what outcome do I want? Not emotionally, practically. Did I want validation from people who hadn't asked questions before? Did I want to correct impressions that didn't affect my future? Did I want to win a narrative, or did I want to exit it entirely? Those questions didn't have dramatic answers. They had measured ones. I realized I didn't need the story to flip overnight. I didn't need sympathy or apologies or public acknowledgement. What I needed was clean separation, financially, legally, emotionally, and that required patience. I kept paying the rent for a while longer, not out of obligation, but out of timing. There were systems to untangle, names to remove, agreements to end cleanly. I consulted professionals quietly, asked hypothetical questions, learned my options without signaling my intentions. I made sure that when I eventually stepped back, nothing would collapse abruptly, not because I owed him protection, but because I valued order. Throughout all of this, the public story continued to evolve without me. He spoke more openly about feeling blindsided, about not knowing what had gone wrong. People responded predictably. They filled the gaps with assumptions that fit what they already believed about me. She's independent, she's fine, she moved on. I let them, because the private reveal had taught me something essential. Truth doesn't need an audience to be real. I didn't feel powerful in the way movies depict it. I felt grounded, anchored, like I was standing on solid ground after months of walking across something flexible and uncertain. There's a particular peace that comes from knowing you could speak, but don't need to. From understanding that if the story were ever questioned, you wouldn't have to defend yourself. You would simply present reality as it was, calmly, without embellishment. I wasn't holding the receipts like weapons. I was holding them like coordinates. They showed me where I actually stood. And once I knew that, every next decision became clearer. That night, I put everything away neatly. I labeled folders, I backed things up, I locked nothing away out of fear, but out of respect for accuracy. Then I went to bed and slept deeply for the first time in a long while, because the reveal wasn't about him at all. It was about me finally seeing the full shape of what I had been carrying and realizing I could choose when and how to set it down. Clarity changes the nature of choice. Before, every decision I made felt reactive, based on incomplete information, emotional fog, or the need to keep things functioning. After the private reveal, decisions became quieter, heavier, and more deliberate. Not because they were harder, but because they were final. I reached a point where I understood something fundamental. Doing nothing was also a decision. Continuing to pay the rent indefinitely, continuing to let the narrative circulate unchallenged, continuing to absorb responsibility while being described as absent, none of those were neutral positions anymore. They were active choices with long-term consequences. I laid out my options the way I lay out budgets, without drama, without moral inflation. Option 1, speak up publicly, correct the story, show receipts, clarify timelines, risk becoming defensive, petty, or calculating in the eyes of people who hadn't asked for my side in the first place. Option 2, confront him directly, lay everything out, demand acknowledgement, possibly get an apology that would change nothing structurally, and still leave me responsible for disentangling the mess. Option 3. Walk away quietly, but incompletely. Reduce support slowly, hope the story fades, accept that loose ends would trail behind me for years. Option 4. Make a clean, irreversible cut. Not emotionally, not theatrically, structurally. I didn't choose immediately. I gave myself time, not because I was unsure, but because irreversible choices deserve stillness before execution. I wanted to be sure that what I was about to do came from alignment, not resentment. During that time, my husband reached out more often. Not urgently, casually, updates about his stress, subtle reminders of how much he was struggling, occasional references to how alone he felt. I listened. I responded politely. I offered nothing beyond what was already in motion. Friends checked in too, some with genuine concern, some with curiosity, a few with quiet judgment masked as care. "You seem distant," one said. "You're very calm about all this," another noted. They weren't wrong. Calm wasn't indifference, it was a resolution settling in. I realized something else during that period. If I corrected the story now, it would still center him. His behavior, his misrepresentation, his feelings. But if I chose structural action instead, the truth wouldn't need narration. It would surface naturally through consequences that didn't require my voice. I wasn't interested in winning understanding. I was interested in ending the obligation. The irreversible option began to feel less like withdrawal and more like completion. So I prepared for it carefully. I confirmed timelines, I reviewed contracts, I ensured there would be no sudden crises, no unpaid bills, no legal confusion, no ambiguity that could be framed as cruelty. I did this not to protect his feelings, but to protect the integrity of my choice. Because once I stepped back, I wanted it to be unmistakably intentional. The night I made the final decision, nothing dramatic happened. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. I wrote a short list in my planner, not of emotions, but of actions. Each one is finite, each one leading in the same direction. End autopay, transfer responsibility, remove my name, document confirmation, no commentary, no warnings, no speeches. That was the moment I understood the difference between silence as avoidance and silence as authority. I wasn't disappearing, I was concluding my involvement. And once that decision was made, truly made, I felt something settle into place inside me. A sense that the story no longer needed my participation to resolve itself. Because when you stop holding something up, gravity does the rest. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy, it's about precision. Once the decision was made, I didn't rush. I didn't announce anything. I didn't change my tone, posture, or availability. From the outside, I remained exactly who I had always been: steady, reasonable, unremarkable. Internally, everything was in motion. I treated the process the way I treated any complex system, one component at a time, in the correct order. No overlaps, no loose ends. The first step was administrative, not emotional. I reviewed every account my name touched. Some were obvious. Others had been set up years earlier and forgotten because they had never caused problems. Auto payments are like that. They disappear into the background when they work. I didn't shut anything off abruptly. I scheduled endings, clean ones, notifications sent with neutral language, no blame, no explanation beyond what was required. Effective as of this date, responsibility will transfer. Please confirm. Each message was brief, factual, and unambiguous. I kept copies of everything. Not out of fear, but out of habit. Accuracy had become my anchor. If anything was questioned later, I wanted the timeline to speak for itself. I also spoke to a lawyer. Not because I expected a fight, but because I wanted to make sure my silence wouldn't be misinterpreted as negligence. We reviewed what I owed legally and, just as importantly, what I didn't. That distinction mattered more than I expected. So much of what I had been carrying wasn't obligation at all. It was an assumption, momentum, the quiet continuation of roles no one had formally assigned, but everyone relied on. Knowing where my responsibility ended gave me permission to stop exactly there. Throughout this process, my husband continued to talk. Not to me directly, at least not in any way that acknowledged what was changing, but to others. His story grew more detailed, more emotional. He spoke about scrambling, about uncertainty, about feeling unsupported. People listened. No one noticed that the scrambling only began once the systems I'd maintained started transitioning out of my hands. No one connected the timing. Why would they? Those details weren't visible, and I didn't make them visible. That was the point. Moving in silence meant letting cause and effect line up without commentary, letting the absence of my labor reveal its own shape. I still answered messages, still showed up when necessary, still behaved in ways that made people comfortable. I didn't want to be remembered as someone who changed overnight, because I hadn't. I was simply no longer compensating. There's a strange moment when you stop holding something together and realize how much tension your hands were absorbing, not because anyone asked you to, but because if you hadn't, things would have shifted sooner. I felt that release gradually, in small ways. Fewer mental calculations, less anticipatory planning, no longer tracking outcomes I wasn't responsible for. Financially, things began to rebalance. Emotionally, so did I. What surprised me most was how little anyone noticed at first. People are accustomed to stability appearing from nowhere. When it disappears, they look for drama, not structure. There was no drama to find. Just emails that had ended, payments that are no longer processed, responsibilities that had quietly returned to their rightful owner. I didn't explain this to my husband in advance, not because I wanted to shock him, but because advanced explanations had always been used to negotiate my boundaries away. This time, the boundary existed before it was discussed. When he finally asked, casually, confused, why something hadn't gone through, I answered calmly, factually, without apology. I'm no longer handling that. No backstory, no justification. Silence after that kind of sentence is different. It doesn't invite argument, it signals completion. That's when I knew I had moved correctly. Because moving in silence isn't about disappearing, it's about removing yourself so cleanly that nothing is left to debate. And once that happens, the consequences don't need narration. They begin on their own schedule. Consequences rarely arrive with an announcement. They don't say, "This is because of that." They just begin. Quietly, then persistently, like a change in weather you can't ignore once you step outside. Sia. At first, the effects of my withdrawal were subtle enough to be misattributed. A missed payment here, a delayed response there. Minor inconveniences that could be explained away as bad timing, system errors, or temporary stress. My husband complained about them casually, to friends, to family, even to me. "Everything feels harder all of a sudden," he said once with a tired laugh. "I don't know why nothing's working the way it used to." I listened. I didn't respond beyond acknowledgement, because I knew exactly why. What had changed wasn't his capability. It was the disappearance of invisible scaffolding, the quiet adjustments I used to make before problems became visible, the anticipatory fixes, the follow-ups no one ever saw. Without those, reality became louder. Bills needed attention. Deadlines need to be remembered. Conversations with landlords and service providers suddenly required clarity instead of assumptions. And for the first time, those responsibilities sat squarely where they belonged. People around him noticed the shift before they understood it. They described him as stressed, overwhelmed. Not himself lately. They rallied, they offered advice, so sympathy, so an encouragement. No one mentioned me, not in the way that mattered. No one said, "This didn't come out of nowhere." No one asked, "Who was handling this before?" Absence is difficult to measure when you never acknowledge presence. When my name came up, it was usually in the same tone, concerned, distant, vaguely disapproving. "She seems fine, though. She's very independent. I guess she moved on quickly." I let those interpretations stand. Meanwhile, the gap between the public story and the private reality widened. He spoke more openly about feeling abandoned, about being left to deal with everything on his own. The irony of those words sat quietly with me, not sharp enough to wound, but clear enough to instruct. I realized then that some narratives don't collapse when contradicted. They collapse when they're no longer subsidized. The consequences continued, not as punishment, but as exposure. Systems he had never needed to understand now demanded attention. Processes he had assumed would just work revealed their complexity, and the confidence with which he had once spoken about being self-sufficient began to soften. He asked questions, more often, more urgently. Not emotional ones, practical ones. How does this work? Who do I contact? When does this renew? Each question was a small admission, not of fault, but of dependency. I answered only when necessary, briefly, clearly, without stepping back into the role I had exited. I'm not managing that anymore. You'll need to handle it. The information is in the account. Every response was true. None of them was unkind. And that's when I noticed something else. People are far more uncomfortable with quiet boundaries than they are with loud conflict. A raised voice can be dismissed as emotion. A calm refusal cannot. Friends who had once praised my patience now describe me as hard to read. Family members asked if I was being too rigid. One person said gently, "You could help him a little. He's struggling." I thought about that for a long time. Then I realized something important. Struggle isn't proof of injustice. Sometimes it's just the first honest data point after a long period of distortion. The consequences weren't catastrophic. No one's life imploded. But they were undeniable. And they were cumulative. Each missed convenience, each unfamiliar responsibility, each moment where the old story stopped matching the lived experience. That mismatch created discomfort, and discomfort demanded explanation. For the first time, the question shifted from why did she leave? How was this all working before? I didn't answer that question. I didn't need to. Because consequences don't argue. They don't persuade. They simply continue. And once they begin, they tend to move in only one direction, toward clarity. By the time the panic set in, the window for fixing anything had already closed. That's the part people rarely understand, that repair requires timing, not just intention. And timing is something you only get right when you've been paying attention from the beginning. The first signs weren't dramatic. They came disguised as confusion. My husband started reaching out more directly, his messages longer, less casual. He asked questions he'd never needed to ask before, not just how things worked, but why they had been set up that way in the first place. There was a subtle shift in tone, less certainty, more urgency. "I didn't realize how much you were handling," he said once. "I guess I underestimated it." That word, underestimated, landed with a strange finality, because it wasn't wrong. And it wasn't enough. Around him, the mood changed too. Friends who had once nodded along to his version of events began offering advice instead of sympathy. Practical suggestions, budgeting tips, questions that required accountability rather than comfort. He didn't like those questions. They forced him to confront a reality he had never needed to fully inhabit before, one where systems didn't maintain themselves, where stability required sustained attention, not just confidence. That's when the regret started showing up. Not as remorse, but as anxiety. He tried to revisit old conversations, reframe moments, soften the narrative. He said things like, "I wish we'd communicated better," and "I didn't know you felt that way." I listened. But communication can't be retroactive when the structure it depended on has already been dismantled. What he wanted, I realized, wasn't resolution, it was restoration. A return to a dynamic where I compensated quietly and he remained unaware of the cost. That version of me no longer existed. He asked if we could talk things through. He suggested starting fresh. He implied that things had gotten out of hand too quickly. They hadn't. They had simply reached visibility. I didn't argue. I didn't list grievances. I didn't bring out receipts or timelines. I didn't need to. I told him calmly that I had made my decisions deliberately, that they weren't reactions, that they weren't punishments, that they were conclusions. That was when he finally understood something was irreversible. Panic doesn't always look like desperation. Sometimes it looks like bargaining wrapped in reasonableness, like suddenly acknowledging effort after it's no longer being offered. He wanted reassurance that I wasn't trying to hurt him. I told him the truth. I wasn't. I was trying to be accurate. Accuracy, it turns out, can feel cruel to people who are used to being protected from it. By then, the narrative outside had started to crack on its own. Not publicly, not dramatically, but in quiet side conversations. People noticed inconsistencies, timelines that didn't align, stories that relied too heavily on assumptions. Someone asked him if he was sure he'd been abandoned, given how long things had continued functioning afterward. He didn't have a clean answer, because it was too late to rewrite a story once the facts began surfacing on their own. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this unfold. I felt distance. A clean, unemotional distance that comes when you know you've already done the hardest part. The fixing phase requires humility before leverage shifts. After that, it's not repair, it's regret management. And regret, once it arrives, doesn't entitle anyone to access they no longer have. By the time he truly wanted to understand what he'd lost, I had already finished letting go. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly calm. No raised voices, no accusations thrown back and forth, no moment where everything spilled out at once, just two people sitting across from each other with very different understandings of what that moment meant. He had asked to meet. Neutral place, neutral time. He framed it as a conversation for closure. I agreed, not because I needed it, but because I no longer avoided clarity. He started by talking. He always did. He spoke about confusion, about how quickly things had changed, about how blindsided he felt. He used words like miscommunication, distance, and drift. He framed the situation as something mutual that had simply gone wrong. I let him finish. When he paused, waiting for me to respond, I didn't rush to fill the silence. I took a breath, not to steady myself, but to mark the shift from listening to speaking. I didn't leave suddenly, I said. I stopped compensating. That was all. The sentence landed heavily, not because it was sharp, but because it didn't invite rebuttal. It wasn't an interpretation, it was a statement of fact. He tried to redirect. He asked why I hadn't said something sooner. Why hadn't I told him how much I was carrying? I answered honestly. I did, in small ways. And when that didn't change anything, I paid attention instead. He looked uncomfortable, not angry, not defensive, just unsettled. I didn't list examples. I didn't itemize sacrifices. I didn't show receipts. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. This conversation wasn't a trial. It was a boundary. I explained calmly that I wasn't interested in revisiting the past for the sake of emotional processing. That my decisions weren't about blame. They were about alignment. I needed my actions to match reality, I said. They do now. He asked if there was any chance of reconsideration. That was the only moment when I saw something like fear. I answered gently, but clearly. No, not I don't think so. Not maybe later. Just no. There was a long pause after that. The kind that used to make me uncomfortable. The kind I would have filled before with reassurance or softening. I didn't this time. I wished him well. Not performatively, not coldly, just sincerely. I told him I hoped he found stability and support. I meant it, but I didn't offer myself as either. When we stood to leave, there was no dramatic ending. No final words meant to echo. Just the quiet understanding that whatever dynamic had existed between us no longer did. I walked away feeling lighter, not because I had won, but because nothing was unresolved. Confrontation without heat doesn't give you adrenaline, it gives you finality. And finally, when earned, it is peaceful. Who I am now looks very ordinary from the outside. I still live quietly. I still pay my bills on time. I still move through the world without announcing myself. If anything, my life is less dramatic than it was before. But the difference is internal and permanent. I no longer confuse calm with compliance. I no longer mistake endurance for virtue. And I no longer allow my silence to be interpreted as consent. The role I once occupied, reliable, flexible, endlessly understanding, has loosened its grip on me. Not because I rejected those traits, but because I redefined them. Reliability now includes me. Flexibility has limits. Understanding does not require self-erasure. I don't explain my decisions to people who haven't earned context. I don't rush to correct assumptions unless they affect my future. I let others sit with their interpretations without feeling responsible for adjusting them. That has been one of the hardest lessons and one of the most freeing. There are people who still believe the old story, the simple one, the version where I left and moved on without looking back. I don't correct them. Not because the truth would hurt, but because it's no longer necessary. What matters is that my life is structurally honest now. My time, my money, and my attention align with my values. There are no invisible systems propped up by my exhaustion. No quiet compensations drain energy from places it belongs. I've learned that quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over access. Who gets your labor? Who gets your emotional availability? Who gets explanations? And just as importantly, who doesn't? I'm still kind, still measured, still calm, but I'm no longer available for narratives that require my disappearance. If someone wants to understand me, they can ask. If they don't, I let that be information. There's no bitterness in this stage. No lingering desire to be seen differently by people who benefited from misunderstanding me. There is only clarity. And clarity, once integrated, doesn't need reinforcement. It holds. There's a particular myth we're taught early on that truth, if it matters, will eventually speak for itself. That if you live with integrity long enough, people will see it. That silence is always dignified. I don't believe that anymore. At least not in the simple way it's usually framed. Truth doesn't speak. Structures do. What happened in my life wasn't about exposing a lie. It was about withdrawing support from one. The story that painted me as someone who walked away could only exist because I was still quietly holding things together behind the scenes. Once I stopped doing that, reality began to surface on its own. That's the part people miss. You don't always need to correct a false narrative. Sometimes you just need to stop funding it. This story isn't a warning against kindness or patience. Those qualities are still valuable, but they become dangerous when they're offered without boundaries, when they turn into obligations you never agreed to. Quiet people are often underestimated because we don't announce our thresholds. We adapt, we compensate, we make things work, and in doing so, we teach others what they can get away with. Until one day we stop. And when we do, it's rarely loud. It doesn't look like revenge. It looks like alignment. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. You don't owe your silence to anyone who benefits from it. You don't need to prove your version of events to people who never asked for your side. And you don't need permission to remove yourself from roles that cost more than they give. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let your absence speak, calmly, cleanly, without explanation. If you've ever been described in ways that didn't match the reality of what you were carrying, if you've ever watched someone tell a story about you that only worked because of your quiet labor, if you've ever wondered whether staying silent was strength or self-erasure, I'd love to hear from you. What did it cost you to stay quiet? And what changed when you finally stopped?